Hey guys! So today's video is a tutorial on how I made my Mew Ichigo costume. Specifically in this video, I used the pattern that I made and I sell it in my pattern store. This will give you a good idea if you want to make your own from scratch. It'll kind of show you, what I'm doing. If you're using my pattern, this is a really good way to see how I'm putting it together. You don't have to do it the same way I'm doing it. Some things you may want to change to make it easier for you. You just have a better way of doing it, a different way you want to try. That's totally fine. That's why I didn't want to include instructions with the pattern. I feel like it really should be put together however you feel comfortable and you want to do it. But there are a few really tricky parts of Ichigo's costume, like her bubble skirt. So this is a really good overview of how I put together my costume and will hopefully help you with putting together yours. So let's get started.
First, we have to make the inside of the skirt and the petticoat. To start, I'm going to cut out the yoke from my muslin and main fabric. All of this is going to be on the inside of the garment, so you can cut it out of anything, but I suggest choosing an easy to work with fabric. The muslin yoke will be used as a base for all the petticoat ruffles, and the pink yoke will be used as a lining piece. Because I'll be sewing the ruffles onto my muslin pieces, I use an iron-on interfacing. This will help keep the yoke from warping or bunching up while I sew. When you see how unmanageable the ruffles get later, you'll understand why. Once the seams of both yokes are sewn and ironed, I set aside the pink one for later. On the muslin yoke, I'm going to use a pencil to mark sewing lines. The top line is my seam allowance, then I mark 6 more lines half an inch apart. A 2-inch, 6-inch, 8, 10, 12, and 14-inch ruffle. Now I'm going to cut all the tulle for my ruffles. I want to gather my tulle down at a ratio of 4:1. So for every 4 inches of tulle I cut, it will gather down into 1 inch of ruffle. But I always cut my strips extra long to have some wiggle room, since I'm no good at math. For my petticoat, I need to cut 2 strips for each layer of ruffles, plus 3 additional 5-inch wide strips so I can add an extra ruffle to the ends of my 3 longest ruffles for extra poof. Poof is the key word here. I'm lucky to have a ruled cutting mat to make this a lot faster. I have no idea what the math on this ends up being, but it felt like I cut out about 6 miles of strips for this darn petticoat. Now you've got to gather all those strips up into ruffles. And don't judge me for using black thread here. This all ends up never being seen and I didn't want to use up all my pink thread. I'm going to gather my 2, 6, and 8-inch wide ruffles. I cut 2 layers for each tier of ruffles and I'm gathering both of them at the same time. If you don't know how to gather on your machine this easily, I already made a tutorial on how to do it that I will attempt to link to here. We'll see if I can figure it out. After my first 3 ruffles are gathered, I'm going to sew them down to my yoke on the corresponding lines I drew earlier. It's really important here to sew all of the ruffles on upside down. By sewing them on with the seam allowance positioned to face the bottom of the yoke instead of the top, you get a little extra lift in each layer, and therefore more poof. And poof is the key. For the top 3 tiers of ruffles, I need to create ruffleception, by which I mean add another ruffle to my ruffles. So by gathering each of the 5-inch wide strips I cut earlier to make super extra long ruffles, I can now sew them 5 inches up from the bottom on 1 layer of each of my 10, 12, and 14-inch ruffles. I keep telling you, it's all about the poof here. And once all my bottom ruffles are sewn, I can gather the top of each ruffle so they're ready to be sewn into my petticoat, which is the most difficult part of this whole costume. As I added the layers to the yoke, this became more and more frustrating to sew. I had to be really careful not to catch anything I didn't mean to sew under the needle, like a stray ruffle or my finger. Don't let yourself get lost in the poof. We don't want any fingers lost here. Now enjoy this finished petticoat and an incredibly crooked shot of my messy sewing room. Now that the petticoat is done, I can finally move on to actually getting some fabric wrapped around this thing. It may look too puffy for Mew Ichigo, but the fabric is actually going to weigh down that majestic puff quite a bit. The pattern says to cut the skirt fabric on a fold, so it'll be one giant piece, but my fabric isn't long enough to do this, so I just cut out 2 pieces and made side seams. The pattern doesn't have a waistband because it's really up to you how you want to finish the waist. Because it's covered by the bodice, you don't have to put a lot of work into making a nice waistband, but in this video I will. I cut out a rectangle that's 4 1/4 inches wide and 3 inches longer than my waist measurement, and then I make sure to interface it with a lightweight interfacing. But before I can do any real sewing together of things, I have to gather the top and bottom of my long skirt rectangle. This is different from the gathering that I did for the petticoat, because for the petticoat I wanted fast, tight gathers and I didn't really need a lot of control. But for the skirt, I want to be able to closely control how much my fabric is gathered. For this, I need to sew 3 lines, about 1/8 of an inch apart, at my machine's longest stitch length. The skirt piece is really long, so I had to be super patient while I was sewing all these little lines. Once all of my gathering stitches were in, I could use them to gather my fabric. I did this by pulling all 3 threads on the front of the fabric at the same time. You have to move the gathered fabric down and continue pulling these threads to gather up more and more of the length. Some people will sew just 1 or 2 lines of gathering stitches, or they'll zigzag over a length of string, but I find doing it the long way with 3 lines of stitching always gives me the best results. I needed to gather the entire top of my skirt down into my waist measurement, which is about 3 inches of fabric gathered down into 1 inch. I pinned it to my waistband as I went along to help me get even gathers, but I'm not going to sew it to the waistband just yet. If you wanted to skip making a waistband, you could just gather it to the top of your yoke instead. Before I start gathering the bottom edge of the skirt, I need to sew a few inches of the bottom of my back seam. Then, repeat the entire gathering process along the bottom edge of the skirt. To get the nice bubble shape of the skirt, I gather the bottom of the skirt onto the outer edge of a large circular lining piece. It seems crazy, but it's all going to work out. I just gather the bottom edge of the skirt to fit the circular lining piece, pin it into place, and sew. Remember that pink yoke I sewed at the beginning of the video? Time to break that back out. I'm going to pin it on top of my petticoat yoke and sew it down around all 4 edges. This gives the inside a nice clean look and hides all that ugly stitching. I could have totally skipped this part, but I wanted the inside to look nice. Now, this is where it can get pretty confusing, but stick with me because the end result is worth it. The inside of the circular lining piece is going to get sewn to the bottom of the yoke. I'm pinning them right sides together, and I'll have to try and keep all the layers of the petticoat out of the way while I sew this. Once that seam is sewn, I can flip the skirt around the petticoat and start to tuck all that glorious puff into the skirt. You can finally see it starting to take shape. Now I'll just pin the top of the skirt panel to the top of the yoke and make sure it's all gathered down to fit nicely. Now I have to sew the back edges of my petticoat together at the bottom, and then put in an invisible zipper and sew up the back. Because I essentially have a loop of fabric here, it's a little tricky to sew up the back seam cleanly. I essentially sewed in the length zipper I needed to the skirt panel and yoke, then sewed as much of the remaining back seam as I could with the machine. There were about 3 inches of the back seam I had to sew by hand. This is where I would love to put in a soundbite from the final countdown, but we all know how UMG and YouTube feel about that. With my skirt gathered to my yoke and my zipper sewn in, I can now put the waistband on. Remember how I cut my waistband 3 inches longer than my waist? That's so I can have an overlapping tab to sew a hook and eye onto. I sew up both edges of the waistband and start pinning it on from one edge to the other. Once I get to the other end, I'll have about 2 inches of waistband overhanging my yoke. With the waistband flipped over and sewn down, I can sew on a hook and a couple eyes and finally be done with this skirt. Okay, so I can finally lay out and cut my bodice pieces. I like to use a heavier fabric for my lining. This helps hold the bodice shape and support the zipper and the seams. Okay, so sorry for the abrupt ending, but YouTube won't let me upload a video over 11 minutes long because my account is too small and sad. So I had to awkwardly cut this video into a part 1 and a part 2. So I will link to part 2 right here, and you can go and watch that next. Thanks!